The last breath of a patient would often go unnoticed behind the thick green-painted doors of Building 21. Deep in the outskirts of Trenton, New Jersey, in the once bustling campus of Trenton State Hospital, the building sat like an uninvited guest to history, a part of the institution's grounds, but whispered about by staff, avoided by patients, and eventually sealed shut. Most who passed it in the 1970s did so quickly, their eyes averted, as if looking too long might invite something unwelcome. Behind its bricked facade, beneath layers of peeling paint and the heavy presence of mold, sat a chapter of psychiatric history deliberately erased, yet disturbingly true. Originally opened in 1848 as the New Jersey State Lunatic Asylum, Trenton State Hospital was meant to embody a new vision of mental health care, based on the moral treatment model championed by pioneering reformer Dorothea Dix. The first superintendent, Dr. Horace Butolph, upheld that vision. But the dream began to rot from within in the early 20th century, and by the time Dr. Henry Cotton took the reins in 1907, something far darker had already begun. Dr. Cotton believed that insanity was caused by hidden infections in the body, rotten teeth, inflamed tonsils, decaying bowels, and he had the authority to act on that belief. His treatment philosophy wasn't just radical, it was surgical. He ordered the removal of patients' teeth, tonsils, gallbladders, colons, and even parts of their stomachs, convinced it would cure their madness. More than 645 surgeries were performed in just a few years, with a mortality rate that hovered ominously above 40%. Cotton reported miracle cures. Independent investigations told a different story. But these horrors were public, known, documented in medical archives, and eventually condemned. What lay deeper inside Building 21 was not only more disturbing, it remained hidden in part because those who spoke of it were often silenced by the institution itself. By 1953, long after Cotton's death, Trenton State Hospital had expanded significantly. Building 21 was designated for special cases, those deemed incurable, unmanageable, or too dangerous for general population. Official records referred to it as the Isolation Annex. It was where the so-called treatment-resistant patients were transferred, many of whom never returned. Publicly, its existence was downplayed. Internally, it operated with minimal oversight, staffed by a skeleton crew of attendants and orderlies who rotated frequently, few staying more than a few months. The stories that emerged from former staff, years after the annex was shuttered in 1978, paint a portrait of institutional cruelty masked as care. One nurse, who worked at the hospital for over a decade, recounted how patients in Building 21 were subjected to experimental electroconvulsive therapy, not as a therapeutic measure, but as behavioral correction. Another orderly recalled that the basement held rooms with drain holes in the center, where patients were hosed down like animals after days of being left to defecate in their restraints. He remembered the smell, a mixture of human waste, damp rot, and the coppery tang of old blood that seemed to live in the walls. What set Building 21 apart, however, wasn't merely neglect, it was the atmosphere. According to staff reports archived in the state's Department of Human Services, many who worked shifts inside the annex began to experience auditory hallucinations, whispers in rooms that were empty footsteps and hallways long after the last patient was locked in for the night. Some reported seeing shadowy figures watching from the corners of rooms, only to vanish when approached. In one particularly chilling incident in 1967, a night orderly named Robert Wilkins was found unconscious in the annex's east corridor, bleeding from the ears and nose, with no sign of struggle or trauma. He never returned to work, and later told investigators he had heard the sound of screaming coming from inside the walls. The hospital administration dismissed such claims as stress-induced delusions. But between 1965 and 1977, a total of 14 staff members assigned to Building 21 either quit abruptly, were institutionalized themselves, or died under suspicious circumstances. A psychiatric technician named Eleanor Hughes threw herself from the third floor of the Annex during a shift. Her suicide note read only, "They won't stop whispering." In another case, a janitor named Miguel Serrano vanished during his night rounds. His body was never recovered, and the hospital gave no official explanation for his disappearance. Internal memos, obtained decades later through Freedom of Information Act requests, reveal hushed administrative concern, but no formal investigation. By the late 1970s, reports of abuse within the entire hospital system had reached a boiling point. Whistleblower testimonies from former doctors and nurses reached the New Jersey Assembly. The federal government threatened to revoke funding. In 1978, Building 21 was quietly closed. The doors were sealed, the patients either transferred or declared dead, and the structure left to decay behind overgrown hedges and rusted fences. Though Trenton State Hospital itself continued operating under different names into the 2000s, the Annex remained untouched, frozen in time. In 1993, a group of local historians attempted to catalog the forgotten architecture of the hospital grounds. When they reached Building 21, they found it locked, its entrances welded shut. But someone had pried a basement window open years earlier, leaving a narrow crawl space. Inside, they discovered a perfectly preserved wing of what could only be described as a therapeutic prison. Restraint chairs with leather cuffs still bolted to the floor, medical equipment left mid-use, a clipboard dated 1976 still hanging from the wall with the name of a patient whose records could not be found in any surviving hospital archive. Most disturbing were the audio recordings discovered in the nurse's station, buried beneath a pile of rusted files. Labeled simply sessions, the tapes contained the sounds of crying, incoherent screams, and a repeated thudding noise that one forensic analyst later described as consistent with bone-striking steel. The tapes were never publicly released. A fire destroyed the storage facility where they had been temporarily kept for digitization. No criminal charges were ever filed. For decades, the site attracted urban explorers and ghost hunters. Those who managed to sneak inside came back shaken. One journalist, writing for a local New Jersey alt weekly in 2004, described seeing writing scratched into the walls in a dozen different handwritings. Messages like, "Still here," "I didn't lie," and "The doctor watches." Her accompanying photographs, published shortly before her resignation from the paper, show what appears to be a shadow figure standing at the end of a hallway, though skeptics have since debated the authenticity of the image. What remains indisputable is that Building 21 existed. Patients were sent there. Many were never seen again. And while Trenton State Hospital's official history tends to omit its most disturbing chapters, archived government reports, survivor testimonies, and the architectural remains of the Annex confirm a pattern of cruelty and concealment. It is not a haunted house in the fictional sense. It is not the setting of an urban legend. It was a real place, staffed by real people where real suffering occurred, sanctioned by medical authority and hidden by bureaucratic indifference. The state of New Jersey eventually sold the hospital grounds to developers, and in 2021, demolition began on most of the remaining buildings. But Building 21 was not among them. As of 2025, it remains standing, heavily barricaded, overgrown, and officially off-limits. Local residents claim they still hear strange sounds on quiet nights, echoes carried by wind through shattered windows. Theories abound that the spirits of those wronged remain trapped, that the building itself was cursed by decades of anguish, or that the psychological damage inflicted there carved something permanent into its very foundation. There are no conclusive answers, only fragments, testimonies, photos, documents, and the heavy silence that now surrounds the building. But in the shadows of Trenton, where history and horror intersect, Building 21 remains a grim monument to the darkest corners of American psychiatric care, forgotten by design but never entirely gone.